My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding. As I look around, I think I know just about everybody in the room, but to those few that I don't know, very glad to welcome you here. The Dickey Center, we decided to do something a little bit different this summer, and that is to have some public presentations. Usually the summertime has been a quieter period without public presentations. But we feel, with 1/4 of the student body here and so many others, in the community, that we wanted to, start to try to offer some events this summer. And we're delighted to offer today's events. The genesis for this, in March of this year, I had the pleasure to be a Woodrow Wilson visiting fellow at Stetson University in Florida. And my wonderful host is standing to the right of me, Professor Michael Denner from Stetson University, who is in the Russian department, really is the Russian department, but also is head of the wonderful honors program at Stetson. Stetson's a fine university in Florida. I got to thinking, I thought, gee whiz, I heard about Michael's work on Tolstoy, and I thought that would be a wonderful lecture, for us to have this summer. He edits a journal on Tolstoy. His PhD is from Northwestern University. And I've already heard a little bit about what Michael is going to talk about before. And I think you're going to find this a very interesting and stimulating discussion about Tolstoy and the Russian Revolution of 1917 and his influence and really how he was used in many, many ways. But Michael, we're delighted to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Ken for that delightful introduction, and thank him for his very kind invitation. I don't see Lev Losif here, but I wanted to thank him. I had the opportunity to talk with his students today and to interact with some Dartmouth students, and it was a great discussion of some literature by Tolstoy. I'm not going to talk about Tolstoy's literature at all today, and instead I'm going to concentrate more on his on the pre-construction of Tolstoy, and I'll explain what I mean by that. I did want to say a couple things. I want to thank you all for showing up on such a sort of strange time of the year in the academic calendar, late July, late in the afternoon on a Thursday. You all should be drinking beer and enjoying your summer now, and instead you're here. So I will try to keep this modestly light and certainly short. I won't drone on and on. I hope to have about 45 minutes of a lecture and then 15 or 20 minutes of discussion if you all have any questions. You all aren't Tolstoy scholars, and I've tried to approach this in a way that is comprehensible to a more popular audience. When I've presented this material, though, at professional conferences, the reaction has been interesting, and I think you'll see why. I'm going to talk to you about Tolstoy in a way that you probably haven't ever heard anyone talk about a literary figure before, especially someone as revered as Tolstoy. I'd like today to meditate on Tolstoy's image, his social presence generated by various individuals and institutions, reporters and editors and publishers, other belletristic writers, philosophers, visual artists, humorists and caricaturists, literary critics, politicians, clergy, friends, family, familiars, translators, revolutionaries, common people. The list could go on to include other manufacturers of representation, each of which entered into circulating relations with other producers of images. I will explore how these competing centers vied during revolutionary periods for validation and authority through the investiture of Tolstoy's image in the public sphere. The primary documents that I base this research upon are rich and diverse and are largely overlooked since they are too historical for literary scholars and too literary for historians. My approach to interpreting them is akin to that of Natalie Anish in The Glory of Van Gogh, an Anthropology of Admiration, which is a very fine book that was published in the 1990s. Her subtitle indicates her approach of detached curiosity in exploring the pre-construction, the myth of Van Gogh. Her professed aim is to trace, without valorizing one over the other, how both popular and scholarly sources have participated in the generation of Van Gogh's image through writing, words, images, and behavior relating to Van Gogh. By the way, I'm not going to say quote, end quote, and all that. I'll try to indicate when I'm reading somebody else's words by kind of inflecting my voice. Much as an ethnologist might do in conducting participant observation of a given group. My aim, like hers with Van Gogh, is to shed light on the Tolstoy effect, on what stems from him, is summed up in him, and no longer involves just one individual destiny, but more generally, the status imparted to great singular figures. So while I'm interested in the fascinating presence of Tolstoy himself as a great singular figure, I am equally drawn to Tolstoy as a generalizable phenomenon. What can we learn about collective representation as an act of social behavior constrained by social conditions? What can we learn about how we generate images of people as a society in response to social conditions? That's really what I'm interested in. Tolstoy's case is much more complicated than the unrecognized genius Van Gogh. For several reasons, it is useful to speak of a cult of Tolstoy, though cult in a very, very modern meaning, one in which the worshippers consciously participated in the creation of their idol. First, the word cult, why I like this word, accurately conveys the idea that people really did try to align their lives with the teaching of Tolstoy. Tolstoy the prophet, Tolstoy the religious figure, Tolstoy the mystic. It also hints at the potential for there to exist, in addition to this biological creature, Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, who was born in 1828 and died in 1910. There also exists this image of Tolstoy in quotation marks, Tolstoy as a graven image, Tolstoy as an icon, Tolstoy as in all capitals. And in my paper, if you could see the paper as I read it, sometimes I have Tolstoy in all capitals, because I don't mean Tolstoy, this individual, this biological creature. Instead, I mean this representation that has been constructed of Tolstoy. The word cult also allows me to comprehensively refer to the myth of Tolstoy, a narrative begun by Tolstoy himself, but subsequently appropriated by official and popular culture. Finally, the word cult insinuates something illicit, something subaltern, which Tolstoy's cult certainly was. Cults are cults because dominant culture tells us they're cults. Cults have icons. Religions have truths. And there was a cult of Tolstoy, one that was highly politicized and one that was marginalized by political figures in political institutions and political figures. And I'm going to try to touch on that creation of this cult of Tolstoy. Further complicating things were the competing cults surrounding Tolstoy. Van Gogh was just an artist, right? He was just pure artist. But that's not true with Tolstoy. The political cult of Tolstoy coexisted, of course, with the artistic cult, the cult of the great writer of the Russian land, the revered novelist who wrote War and Peace and Anna Karenina. But it is crucial to remember that initially, the political cult far outstripped the literary cult's importance. I have all these, so this is part of a much larger project, and I spent a lot of time sitting in archives and in libraries, reeling through microfilms of newspapers, collecting images and stories about Tolstoy that fell outside of the narrow, official, artistic image of Tolstoy that we literary scholars usually think of, and non-literary scholars think of as well. This is a great caricature of Tolstoy. It's published in 1908 in a very, very fine satirical journal called Satyricon. It's published in 1908. Tolstoy was born, these dates are going to be somewhat important in this. Tolstoy was born in 1828. He died in 1910. So in 1908, they celebrated his 80th birthday, and this was an international celebration. Tolstoy by 1908 was, certainly the best-known Russian in the world, and absolutely one of the best-known people in the world. He was a celebrity at this point. So what's so fascinating about the image of Tolstoy, I talked to you about the two cults of Tolstoy, these competing literary and political cults. But what's great about Tolstoy is that the image of Tolstoy embodies that duality as well, right? That there are two Tolstoys that are both represented in Tolstoy. And this is a great caricature that so well demonstrates this. This is Tolstoy. These are all really poor quality because the paper in the first place was really crappy, and then you take microfilm pictures of it, and then you let that microfilm picture age for 80 years and gather lots of dust, and then so I did the best I could. I cleaned these up. But what you see here is a very, very readily identifiable image of Tolstoy, an iconic representation of Tolstoy. Bald, long beard, barefoot. I mentioned in a faculty seminar today that Russia has a strange obsession with Tolstoy's feet. And you'll see throughout this entire presentation his feet. Bare feet represent a rejection of civilization. And that's so essential to the understanding of Tolstoy as a public figure is this rejecter, this anarch of civilization. So what you see is, I cut off the Russian. I don't know why I did that by accident. Only in children will you discover truth, follow them. That's a quotation from Tolstoy. And Tolstoy, you can read War and Peace and Anna Karenina, and he's following, so he's got his pasokh, he's got his, the pilgrim's staff, right? He's leaving behind his former life and treading on his former works to follow this child. And of course, the child is this devilish, impish creature. So these competing cults, right? You see that the two Tolstoys can be embodied in one Tolstoy, right? The image, it's saturated with meaning like this. I think that's the only one I want to show. Oh, well, here's another one. This is a great one. Now this is 1883. This is very, very, very early. In fact, the vast majority of Tolstoy's political writings had not been published at all. They weren't published until 1886, and then only in Switzerland and France, and it took a long time for them to get published in Russia. But already what's fascinating is in 1883, this is just, this is less than a decade after Anna Karenina is published, he is already part of this myth, right? This myth has already sprung up around him. And the caption down here, the caption is a poem from Lermontov about how this prophet goes into the desert and is forgotten. And everybody knows this passage from Lermontov. In the end, the prophet is just disregarded by society, although Tolstoy wasn't. But again, you have there's the worshiping, adoring masses, the icon of Tolstoy. Already, already in 1883, he already looks like Tolstoy, right? And to the creator of World and Peace, and you have his muse bidding him goodbye, and he's following his own star. So, right, this is this myth of this Tolstoy who is both a rejecter of culture and an emblem of culture, all combined together there. Though surely he overshoots the mark, the Russian emigre revolutionary Sergei Stepnyak, writing in the 1890s, noted that for every one who loves Tolstoy the writer, there are 20 fervent admirers of Tolstoy, the priest of a new religion. Right? These competing cults. Remember the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, all the way until the mid-late 1920s, this political cult, and I use that word very loosely, political. Tolstoy rejected politics, and so to call his cult political is a bit of a misnomer, but I mean political in the broadest sense of this, in this participation in societal institutions. That Tolstoy versus the belletristic, the artistic writer Tolstoy, we've forgotten entirely that the political cult even existed. But during Tolstoy's lifetime and all the way until the 1920s, it was the political cult that people identified with viscerally and immediately with Tolstoy. Not with Tolstoy, the writer of War and Peace, right? But always Tolstoy embodied, or during the entire time of his fame, his celebrity from the 1870s, late 1870s on, Tolstoy was always bifurcated. But at the same time, this image, what's so fascinating about Tolstoy, is that Tolstoy is himself two Tolstoys, always the political and always the artistic cult. The political cult of Tolstoy was eventually, at the end of the 1920s, demolished, and through political, educational, redactorial, and printing practices, refigured as a pure literary cult from which virtually all social elements were removed. If what I say today about Tolstoy's role, or more exactly the role of his image, is unfamiliar to this audience, it is evidence of the success of the Soviet project of refiguring Tolstoy. The shared and extemporaneous projection of Tolstoy as an idol of revolution was begun sometime in the middle of the 1870s by Tolstoy himself. The project continued while he lived through the next 30 years, often beyond Tolstoy's control, and it crescendoed in the years between his death and the public celebrations in 1928 surrounding his 100th Jubilee. Like a medieval cathedral, this half-century-long construction project extended through several generations of participants, including Tolstoy. During the last year of his life, Tolstoy devoted much of his creative energies to a curious project called The Path of Life, a compendium in which he tried to express the universal wisdom of all ages in extraordinarily simple, sometimes elegant maxims gathered here and there from religious, philosophical, belletristic texts, from newspapers and common wisdom, and from Tolstoy's own diaries, and printed mostly without attribution. One way to understand this curious task, this book, this compendium, is to include it as part of Tolstoy's rejection of contemporary civilization and the Victorian concept of progress. Wisdom is eternal, universal, and impersonal. What better way for the world's most famous living author to spite his contemporaries, to demonstrate his unconcern with worldly matters of human praise? During the last years of his life, Tolstoy very publicly sought to vanquish his own personality, a desire that culminated in his flight from home and subsequent lonely yet crowded death in 1910 in a rail station in the middle of nowhere, his dying breath unheard over the clicking of a Pathé Frères film camera positioned outside the window. Given this attempt to create a compendium of universal, impersonal wisdom, it is perhaps odd that an autobiographical vignette finds its way into Path of Life under the heading Battle Against Vanity. This is the story. This is this entry in the Path of Life, this compendium. An old man has a vision of an angel of God descending from the sky with a shining crown. The old man begs the angel for the crown, and the angel responds this way. Look, turning around, the angel pointed at a northern country, and the old man looked and saw a black cloud that covered half the sky and descended towards the earth. And the cloud parted, and a great horde of black Ethiopians became visible, who were moving towards the old man. Behind them all stood one Ethiopian who was so great and so awful that his feet were planted on the earth, while his shaggy head with its awful eyes and red lips jutted into the sky. It's the 1890s. Battle them, defeat them, and I'll put a crown on you. The old man was terrified and said, I can and will battle with them all, but no man can defeat the great Ethiopian, who with his feet stands on the earth, but with his head he abuts the sky. Fool, said the angel of God, all these minor Ethiopians with whom you will not do battle because you fear the great Ethiopian, all of them are but the sinful human desires, and you can do battle with them. The great Ethiopian is the praise of man, for the sake of which live sinful men. There is no need to do battle with the great Ethiopian. There is nothing to him. Do battle with sin, and he will disappear from the earth on his own. This vignette surely seems like a sincere confession by the author of a weakness for public praise, though practiced readers of Tolstoy will recognize its type. Tolstoy had a predilection for publicly castigating himself for his susceptibility to public regard. By promoting the importance of studied indifference to public opinion, the allegory does nothing so much as draw public attention to the author's strenuous battle against public attention. Tolstoy constantly cast Bakhtinian sidelong glances, squinting his eyes towards the listener, the witness, the judge, responding to his reception, trying to influence the reader to see Tolstoy as Tolstoy wished Tolstoy to be seen, the authorized Tolstoy. At least for the last 30 years of his life, a period that begins at the close of the 1870s when Tolstoy, famous then in his own land but virtually unknown outside of Russia, very publicly denounced his literary works like Anna Karenina and War and Peace and proclaimed that he was embarking on a search for spiritual truth and political justice. And ending with his death, Tolstoy was known not so much for what he wrote, but for who he was. Tolstoy was famous for being Tolstoy. He was a celebrity, someone, in Daniel Borstein's lapidary phrase, well known for being well known. Tolstoy lived through and was affected by a shift when the principle of fame changed profoundly. He was born when personality, while not unimportant, was subordinate to achievement. His late career and death, however, coincided with a shift in the nature of fame, when notability no longer was based solely on achievement, when accomplishment had become less important than, quote, the extended publicity or reputation generated from it. That's Borstein. Tolstoy's last decades coincided with the beginning of what Borstein calls the graphic revolution, a period when, quote, man's ability to make, preserve, transmit, and disseminate precise images, end quote, increased at a fantastic pace. The last half of the 19th century, the first revolution in communications technology, had brought terrific advances in speed, quality, and economy of the printing press, as well as the invention of the transatlantic telegraph, the telephone, the phonograph, photography, halftone printing, and very importantly, the film camera. These technological innovations were accompanied and hastened by a sharp rise in literacy and a market for light, non-intellectual reading with lots of pictures. Culture increasingly became a commodity. New technological means of producing and disseminating images produced demand for ever more new images, and this demand drove technological innovation. All this new technology and demand required engaging and dramatic stories with compelling images, and Tolstoy's dramatic life and immediately recognizable face fit the bill. Perhaps he attracted the newly born and rapidly developing mass media and the attention of an image-hungry public because Tolstoy successfully and self-consciously embodied so many contradictions. He was a mystic who was also a rationalist, a count of the highest order, and also just plain old Lev Nikolaevich. He was an amateur shoemaker and an unparalleled artist. He was the enemy of the Russian state and the great writer of the Russian land. He was a hermit and a tourist destination. He was an anti-materialist and a sybarite, a holy fool and an excommunicate, the second Tsar and an anarch, the charismatic leader of a Christian sect and a radical antinomian, a man of uncontested genius who denied genius. Embodying so many paradoxes, Tolstoy became the ideal canvas upon which to construct images of endless attractiveness. This is from the same issue of the satirical journal Satyricon. It's Count L.N. Tolstoy. Remember, he was the Tolstoy family is probably one of the most, certainly one of the most influential, one of the oldest families in Russia, and he belonged to just the absolute cream of the aristocracy. And everybody knows this. So here you have the image of Count Tolstoy and the caption, which I cut off again. I'm sorry about that. The Russian caption. Count L.N. Tolstoy, famous writer of the Russian land. That was the Turgenev sobriquet that he gave Tolstoy. Great sage, titan of human thought, author of works of world-class literature, powerful preacher of peace and tolerance in the universe. And then, you have this opposing image of Tolstoy in his peasant garb. Tolstoy was famous for mowing. He loved to go out in the fields and mow with the peasants and plow with the peasants. And he promoted this idea. Once again, we have feet as a rejection of society. So you get this great paradoxical image, right? This is the powerful preacher of the great writer of the Russian land. Is one of my favorite caricatures of Tolstoy. Tolstoy embraced physical labor as both a necessary of life and a moral corrective. And so he, once again, was very famous for always going out in the fields and mowing and plowing. You have tons of images of him doing this. But at the same time, he was an incredibly well-known person. He received, hundreds and hundreds of letters every week from all over the world. And so we have Tolstoy Tolstoy at work, and his work involves raking up all the correspondence. And again, we have this contradiction, this tension of this common guy without his shoes on again, raking, just plain old Lev Nikolaevich, who's so famous that he has to rake his letters. This is a good one. I haven't been able to find the original. There's a short-lived journal called Life. It's not the same Life that you know, that existed in the 1890s and 1900s, and they ran this, and it was serialized in a lot of Russian publications. It's a funny, here he is dressed like a well-to-do aristocrat, and the working costume for the Russian peasant, because once again, Tolstoy embraced oh no, there we go. Actually, that's the last one there. Let me shift gears. Do I really want to shift gears here? Hold on. Yeah. Let me shift gears from Borstein's revolution, the graphic revolution, to another revolution, the one that took place at the end of the graphic revolution, the 1905 Russian Revolution. In a note dated January 22nd, 1905, to Tolstoy's English biographer, Elmer Maude, who's an excellent biographer, Tolstoy's official biographer, Maria Lvovna, that's Tolstoy's second daughter, wrote to Elmer Maude right after all of the chaos of the 1905 revolution. This is what she wrote about Tolstoy and the 1905 revolution. I have lately returned from Yasnaya, that's Tolstoy's ancestral estate, where I spent 2 months. My father was well, but he is tormented by demands made on him to take part in current events. The liberals want to draw him into their camp, the conservatives into theirs, and the revolutionists into theirs. And he does not belong to any of them, and only asks to be left in peace. People do not understand and do not admit his point of view and think in consequence of what is happening in Russia, he must come down from his Christian standpoint and say something new, say something that they want him to say. That's the end of the letter. The letter was, of course, widely published and quoted. Like all of Tolstoy's familiars, Maria Lvovna took an active part in the social construction of Tolstoy. The letter elaborates some essential and stable features of Tolstoy's relationship with public debates on politics, the very same tensions that the man from the north felt when confronted with the shaggy-headed Ethiopian. In the chaos of worldly concerns, the unruly masses torment Tolstoy with demands. He must come down to their level. He must say something new, and he must say something they want him to say. This image, carefully crafted by Tolstoy and his family, partakes of what Leo Braudy calls the best fame. And this is what Braudy says. It's aloneness. This is the best fame. The best fame. It's aloneness. It's separation from the crowd, even though the famous, more clearly than ever, had emerged from the crowd to assert their personal distinctiveness and thereby demonstrate its potentiality in every member of the audience, right? This is Braudy's notion of fame is what makes a person famous is the fact that they used to be one of us and now they are someone different. And now they are in exile, and they communicate with us, but they always return to their remote place. Key to any star's success is successfully navigating the opposed poles of ordinary and extraordinary, of access and detachment, a maneuver Tolstoy executed brilliant as the genius count come plowman prophet. You see this in these images, right, that I showed you. Tolstoy is a common man. He has spurned the conveniences of modernity. He's eschewed the privileges of his class, and he has joined the people, right? But, of course, the more he tries to join the people, the more he tries to leave behind the privileges of his class and the fame that he has earned as an artist. The more famous he becomes because he tries to leave behind all those accoutrements of fame and privilege. As Byron and Rousseau learned, celebrities never suffer long in solitude, though the throngs of paparazzi and tourists that surrounded Tolstoy indicates the shift that took place during the graphic revolution. Look, I mean, the fact that Tolstoy was famous was one of the most famous things about Tolstoy. This is a great example of this. It's a series of little illustrations, and I'll start with at the very top. The caption reads, "What the correspondents saw and see at Yasnaya." That's where Tolstoy lives. And in the first one, they see Tolstoy rides to the post office and gets his letters. And in the second one, he listens to the letters. And this is a great image of Tolstoy, kicked back on the couch. He's got this grouchy look on him. And one of his disciples, and he had many, is reading him the letters. And as soon as they're read, they're thrown in the wastebasket, right? But there's a big stack. And then, of course, Tolstoy, I talked to you a little bit about his embrace of physical labor. He goes outside and saws wood. And then the next one, he plows for a quarter of an hour. And then it continues. He is besieged by photographers. So this is absolutely true. People would wait in bushes for him to ride by on the horse. They would wait at the train station to see him. There's a great story of how the first filmic images of Tolstoy were made. And this guy basically hid in the bushes. He had the photographer had Sofia Andreevna, Tolstoy's wife's help, because Sofia Andreevna wanted the public to see images of Tolstoy with her. It was very well known that Tolstoy and his wife didn't get along in this period, and Sofia Andreevna, his wife, was really concerned about how the public would see her, and so she wanted this cameraman to capture images of her and Tolstoy getting along. And so she tells the cameraman, hide in the hibiscuses or hydrangeas, and we'll come along. And then they come along. And of course she grabs Leo by the arm and they walk by the camera, and you get this image of Leo Tolstoy and Sofia Andreevna holding hands. And then there's another scene the same. This is the 1908 celebration, the 80th Jubilee, a very famous image of Sofia Andreevna and Lev Nikolaevich sitting on the porch, seeming to get along, although there's a huge public debate on whether or not they're arguing or they're saying nice things to each other that's carried in the press, right? Anyway, so he's besieged by photographers, and the next one, he speaks with correspondents, right? And so you see Tolstoy, he's always angry, right? And everybody's carefully, and then Tolstoy does not approve of the government, but the socialists' activities bother him. And then Tolstoy sits down, and Tolstoy was very, very farsighted. Right? And he writes down and writes the article, "Don't Kill," and publishes it in one day in all the nations. Right? So, and this is very true. Tolstoy would, write an article and then send it off, and it would get published in the New York Times and the London Times and in Frankfurt and all over the world. What I find interesting is this sort of feedback that happens with the press, right? The press is fascinated by Tolstoy, but they're actually more fascinated by the fact that the press is fascinated by Tolstoy. And so the press's obsession with Tolstoy becomes the story about Tolstoy, right? He's famous for being famous. Of course, Tolstoy came down to say something. Celebrities and prophets can remain so only if they leave their compounds and deserts from time to time. But he did not say anything new, and certainly not what they wanted him to say. Tolstoy wrote several articles and booklets on the meaning of the 1905 revolution, which were printed in vast quantities in Russia and translated in the press abroad. We'd call them op-ed pieces today. The gist of his response was predictable for anyone with even a rudimentary understanding and familiarity with Tolstoy's social and political beliefs. And this is what Tolstoy wrote. I picked this almost at random from his writings about revolution. This is what he says. "These complex and difficult circumstances among which we now live in Russia demand from us not articles sent to newspapers," he says in an article sent to a newspaper, "demand from us not articles sent to newspapers." I can never decide. Does he know that he commits these sorts of strange, paradoxical statements, right? Probably. "Nor in speeches at meetings, not going into the street with revolvers, nor dishonest and irresponsible inciting of the peasantry. What's needed now is a strict attitude towards oneself, towards one's own life, which alone is in our power, and the improvement of which alone can improve the general condition of the people." We don't need political activity, right? What we need to do is we need to turn inward and work on our own selves, right? Tolstoy was a perfectionist. He believed in the importance of self-perfection, which would amplify into society. But any direct attempts to change society through politics or violence would never work. Tolstoy's rejection of revolution was unequivocal and consistent. All societal progress depended upon personal moral improvement. This moral improvement consisting primarily of an abnegation of the self in the interest of improving the moral and material plight of one's fellow man. In Tolstoy's language, all societal improvement was the result of an individual subjecting his animal personality to reason and manifesting the power of love. Such was the Christian standpoint from which Tolstoy refused to come down during the 1905 revolution. Given his near total anarchism and rejection of even the potential of social organization to improve the general condition of the people, one wonders what Tolstoy's approval for one faction, the liberals, the conservatives, the revolutionists, might have meant. The nationalist right-wing Duma member Zamoylovsky, speaking out against official commemoration of Tolstoy's death in 1910, posed best the dilemma that all attempts to associate Tolstoy's image with any political or social or economic movement invariably entail. This is what Zamoylovsky said. To honor in a governmental institution a man who rejected this institution, I consider to be self-negation. I consider it to be an inadmissible thing and a thing logically absurd. Right? What does it mean when you seek Tolstoy's authority to validate a social organization, when Tolstoy consistently and vociferously denied the efficacy of any and all political and social action? Oh yeah. These are a little bit out of order. I don't know what's going on, but this is another one of these great images of the fame of Tolstoy. It's entitled Tolstoy in the Bosom of Nature. Tolstoy plows. And so here's this great image, once again, bare feet. Once again, we have Tolstoy and his plow, and he's trying to, live the simple, anonymous life of a peasant, only, of course, he's surrounded by artists and photographers and correspondents. And Tolstoy is famous for being Tolstoy. This other one is a good one too. This is from Satirica, the same episode, same issue. Tolstoy was, again, Tolstoy enjoyed the great thing, the solitude and the strangeness of fame. And during the 1908 celebrations, he was, he tried his best to get them to ignore him. He begged them publicly, please don't celebrate my jubilee. I don't deserve it. Leave me alone. I want to be left in peace. Of course, he did this very vociferously and was printed in all the press and all this, right? So you get this constant paradox. This is a great one, and this is the Jubilee Commission comes, and Tolstoy is hiding behind his wife, and he says, it's not me. It's not my birthday celebration. She's the one who does everything. She's the one who cannot remain silent. She's the one who received the deputies. So once again, and again, Sofia Andreevna, his wife, saw this birthday celebration as an opportunity to demonstrate to the public that she and Tolstoy were not on the skids and that they loved one another and all that, because it was very important for her to be seen as Tolstoy's wife. You get these great images in the Western press of Tolstoy during the 1905 revolution. This one's printed in 1905 by the Illustrated London News, which was run by Cadbury at the time. Cadbury, who's the chocolate baron, who was a Quaker and a pacifist. But anyway, he ran this image of Tolstoy, this iconic image of Tolstoy. This is what the peasants do. This is how you know they're a peasant, is that they have their hand in their belt like this, and the greatest of Russian revolutionaries. But not always was Tolstoy's sort of rejection of politics something that people liked or appreciated. This is a great image. This is I've collected a lot of the anti-Tolstoy images as well, and this is the caption is "The Possessed Drummer." The Russian reads the man who is possessed by Satan, right? So the satanic drummer, something like that, and he's beating on his drum. and his message is windbaggery, pustoslovia, false teaching and popularity. Here's a great one. I love this one. Tolstoy up in a balloon over the industrial background of Moscow, and he's blowing down in his, from his speaker. And I repeat to you, just don't resist evil and everything will be okay, right? So this is Tolstoy the pacifist. Tolstoy was in no sense a liberal. He claimed, for instance, in 1905 that Roosevelt was as bad a dictator as any Russian Tsar had ever been. And despite all this, to be a Russian intellectual during the decade before the revolution meant embracing, at some level of commitment, explicitly Tolstoyan ideas. Rejection of official Christianity, rejection of the Tsarist regime, rejection of bourgeois culture, and an embrace of the simplicity of rural life, an embrace of pacifism, an embrace of Eastern religions, and an embrace of vegetarianism. The Bolsheviks were well aware of this affinity that the liberals, that the intellectuals had for Tolstoy, because so many of them had personally been drawn to Tolstoyism at some point in their lives. And one cannot help but to quote in this context Lenin, writing about Tolstoy and revolution during the 80th anniversary celebration in 1908. The whole of the press is steeped to nausea in hypocrisy of the double kind, official and liberal. The former is the crude hypocrisy of the venal hack. Much more refined and therefore much more pernicious and dangerous is liberal hypocrisy. Their calculated declamations and pompous phrases about the great seeker after God are false from beginning to end, for no Russian liberal believes in Tolstoy's God or sympathizes with Tolstoy's criticism of the existing social order. He associates himself with a popular name in order to increase his political capital, in order to pose as the leader of a nationwide opposition, end quote. Lenin did not exaggerate Tolstoy's cachet, and contrary to what Lenin said, plenty of people believed at least a little bit in Tolstoy's God, or at least in Tolstoy. He was the face of Russian popular discontent. In 1909, the journal Vestnik Znания, the reporter of knowledge, polled the working intelligentsia. I don't know what that means, but that's what they polled. The working intelligentsia for the writer most widely read. This is 1909, a year before Tolstoy dies. Tolstoy placed first with 295 votes. Darwin, second at 152 votes. Karl Marx was a distant 16th with 52 votes. There was thus something of an impersonal political cult, a mass and international movement loosely associated not so much with Tolstoy's political and religious dicta as to the idea of Tolstoy, his image as a prophet and a rebel, an image that was at least as venerated as it was derided, fitting for an idol. Tolstoy sort of, like I said, and became the icon of the liberal opposition to official nationalism, to Tsarism. 1890s, 1900s, I don't know how well you know Russian history, but the Chornya Sotnya, the Black Hundreds, this ultra-nationalist, ultra-right-wing, anti-Semitic, they weren't just anti-Semitic, they hated lots of other people. They were equal opportunity haters. They were very, very powerful political force in the Russian Duma of the time, and also just a real social force all over Russia. Tolstoy was often seen as the epitome of the resistance to this right-wing nationalist movement, because he represented all the things that the Black Hundreds opposed. And this one is the nightmare of the Black 100s, and you see, Tolstoy's icon floating in the sky there. This is a great one. The Soyuzniki were the Unionists. They were the political arm of the Black Hundreds. They wielded quite a lot of influence in the Duma at the time, and that's this Purushkevich. You can recognize him because he always wore a long black frock coat, and he's trying to put out the light of Tolstoy at the top of the lighthouse there. Tolstoy's death and funeral in November of 1910 created an international media circus. This is the one image I'll show you of that. I've got lots. Tolstoy, in the middle of the night, 1910, he has a fight with his wife about literary rights. This is what they fought about. And he gets up, and the guy's 82 years old, but he thinks now's the time to leave home. He wants to become this pilgrim. And so he gets up in the middle of the night, wakes up his daughter, wakes up his doctor, Makovitsky, and they all set off for a grand adventure without any plans or anything like that. Tolstoy just, gets on a train and rides off. He actually plans to go see his sister, who lives in a convent, and he goes and he spends some time with his sister, and then gets back on the train. Of course, he thinks he's gonna leave home and just disappear into the Russian masses. And he's on the train for about 10 minutes before he's recognized by absolutely everyone on the train as Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy. And the press begins to sort of triangulate where he is, and they're trying to find him. And they finally hunt him down at this little railway station in Ostapova, which has been renamed as Tolstoy. It's a couple hundred miles south of Tula, of where Tolstoy lived, essentially. But they're trying to track him down. He falls ill on this train trip, and they put him in the station master's hut, and he dies pretty clearly of just cardiac arrest. His heart stops working, and fluid fills his lungs, and it takes him 3 days to die. And by the time he's dead, tens of thousands of people have descended from all over. All these journalists appear. I figured out that 11 telegrams an hour were sent from the Ostapova telegraph office, right? And so if you think of how long it takes to do, right? So basically, for 3 days straight, the telegraph operator sent messages to Moscow and to London and to St. Petersburg. But anyway, here's Tolstoy trying to flee from society, and look what follows him, just a bunch of journalists once again. Tolstoy's death and funeral in 1910 created an international media circus. As Bill Nickel has argued, Tolstoy was transformed into a cultural endowment where every mention of his name was an investment upon a potential for Tolstoy to encompass, signify, and engender what it was to be Russian in 1910. This potential to represent Russianness was surely the case long before 1910, but it was intensified after his death. Such is the fate of all prophets. Lenin described the 1905 revolution as the great dress rehearsal for the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Tolstoy, whom Lenin acknowledged as having played a major role in the failure of the 1905 revolution, obviously missed the show's premiere. Tolstoy's departure notwithstanding, after the revolution in 1917, once again there was widespread demands that Tolstoy take part in current events. Once again, from all sides, politicians, emigres, intellectuals, and revolutionaries used the media of the age to make Tolstoy say something new and say something they wanted him to say. Far more so than during the 1905 revolution, Tolstoy's myth during the 1917 revolution became the object of bitter partisan wrangling. In the miscellany of the commission charged with marking 100 years from Tolstoy's birth in 1828, this is 1928, this is the miscellany of the commission that was charged with putting together the celebrations for the 100th birthday of Tolstoy. One report offers scientific documentation of Tolstoy's importance for Russia during the revolutionary period. Its diligent documentation of the cult of Tolstoy itself offers a fascinating example of such fetishization of Tolstoy, while simultaneously illustrating the fanatical embrace of bean counting that was soon to grip the planned economy of Stalin's Soviet Union. The authors of this article that purports to show scientific documentation for Tolstoy's importance, claim to have surveyed the newspapers and books published in Russia between March 1st, 1917, that is the aftermath of the first Russian Revolution, the February Revolution, which took place in March, but you all know that, and August 24th, 1924. I don't know why they chose that date, why August 24th, 1924, but this is the parameters that they gave. From March 1st, 1917, to August 24th, 1924. They sought to substantiate, quote, a picture of exceptional interest for L.N. Tolstoy among the wide masses of the Russian population during the revolutionary years. The list of consulted documents includes academic criticism about Tolstoy as a writer, biographies, a few articles about Tolstoy as a thinker and moralist. This is patently and documentably false. There were hundreds of articles about Tolstoy as a thinker and a moralist. But again, this is 1928. This is Bolshevik Russia. This is the period in which they're trying to tamp down on Tolstoy's political, religious cult. They refer to a few articles having to do with Tolstoy as a thinker and a moralist. They helpfully suggest that such nonsense was, quote, no doubt caused by the demands and moods of the time. And finally, the most difficult of all categories for which to provide statistics, they say, the thousands of references to Tolstoy in the popular press. In addition to all the books and academic journals, the authors list about 4 periodicals they consulted, casually adding that they also consulted many minor provincial newspapers as well. The total number of mentions of Tolstoy in all these various categories during this period, 2,710 days, the authors helpfully point out, comes to 4,681, or about 1 allusion every half day. Now, before going on, a distinction needs to be drawn here between Tolstoy's influence on the revolutionary period and the use of Tolstoy's image during that period, which is a very different, albeit related, phenomenon. The claim that Tolstoy, that the text he authored, his moral authority, his direct and indirect personal contacts with followers, influenced to some degree the course of events during the revolutionary period is reasonable, but difficult to validate and of questionable utility, since it could be said of so many others. However, the study of the use of Tolstoy's image involves an analysis of the various expressions of devotion or rejection of to Tolstoy's societal presence in media. A further, even finer distinction ought to be made between Tolstoy's actual influence on the revolution and the influence that contemporaries attributed to him. The former, Tolstoy's actual influence, again, is difficult to document, while the latter can be traced through primary documents. One manifesto or article or speech invoking Tolstoy's influence, be it either to condone or condemn something, gave rise to a reaction, often an outraged one, from opponents who invoked Tolstoy's influence in making their own counter-argument. The potency of his image increased enormously as a result of these debates, culminating in what we would call today an echo chamber. Tolstoy was credited with or condemned for exerting influence that sometimes seems wildly incommensurate with the cause. I've collected about 100 of these references to Tolstoy in the 1917 revolutions, including those from the Anglo-American and French press. There was something of a narrative to this to and fro about Tolstoy's role in the revolution. Initially, in 1917, during the first Russian Revolution, the one that took place in March, but that's called the February Revolution, the newly erupted revolution needed to be absorbed into the pre-existing myth of Tolstoy, understood within its context and trajectory. Was it a Tolstoyan revolution, one caused, for better or for worse, by the societal trends associated with Tolstoy's teaching and influence? To what degree was the cult of Tolstoy responsible for the revolution? This is a great one. The caption to this issue of Current Opinion in January of 1919 reads, the great ancestor of the Bolshevik, Leo Tolstoy, was a great spiritual anarch whose attacks at the foundations of Russian society are held responsible by 2 authorities for the great Russian Revolution. This picture is from there. So at least initially, the first year and a half, 2 years, what happened was that the revolution encountered a pre-existing cult of Tolstoy, right? You had a revolution that occurred against the backdrop of Tolstoy and Tolstoy's teachings. And initially, at least, everybody tried to understand the revolution, especially the February Revolution, and to a little bit of a lesser degree, the October Revolution, in the terms of Tolstoy. Did Tolstoy cause it? Is this revolution actually a Tolstoyan revolution? Will it instantiate and embrace the beliefs and the religious system of Tolstoy? As the revolutionary period took shape and its violent and partisan features became known during the Civil War period, Tolstoy's image became something against which one tested the validity and authenticity of what had recently happened. That is to say that people argued, would Tolstoy have approved of what's happening, right? So you shift from understanding the revolution as part of Tolstoy's legacy to asking whether or not Tolstoy would have approved of the revolution? On what side of the barricades would Tolstoy have stood? And you get people on both sides, people who were anti-communist, the whites who would argue that no, Tolstoy would not have supported the Bolsheviks, they would not have supported a violent revolution, he would have stayed with Russian nationalism. Remember, the Bolsheviks were internationalists. Tolstoy was seen as an emblem of what it meant to be Russian, and many Russians saw the Bolshevik Revolution in October as a rejection of Russianness per se. A lot of Russian nationalists, all of these people, obviously, were by this time in immigration in Paris or in China or in New York. The question was essentially, for whom would Tolstoy have been? And this is the debate that takes place roughly from the middle of 1918 until more or less the end of the Russian Civil War, which happened in 1924, in the summer of 1924. By the end of the Civil War, as the Bolsheviks consolidated control over the country and set to work building the state, the debate changed fundamentally. No longer was the revolution to be measured against Tolstoy. Rather, Tolstoy's myth must be assessed against the stories told about the Bolshevik Revolution, its aims, and its achievements. The question became, is there a place for Tolstoy's bust in the pantheon of the Russian Revolution? Right? So this is the story that unfolds. Now, today I'm only going to discuss a little bit of the first stage, this stage in which the revolution gets absorbed into the myth and the cult of Tolstoy. And I'm going to concentrate on the documents that I found mostly in the Western press because, well, the audience would probably be most interested in what the West said about Tolstoy. Today I only have enough time left to discuss the first stage, the marriage of the new revolutionary period with Tolstoy's image. This use of Tolstoy's image as an idol or an icon was sometimes quite literal. Russkie Vedomosti, Russian news, printed in its March 17th, 1917 edition, that is to say just days after the February Revolution occurred, an account of the demonstrations that took place on March 12th of the year by Count A.N. Tolstoy. It's a story by a guy named Tolstoy, but it's a different Tolstoy. It's a guy named A.N. Tolstoy, who became really a quite well-known Soviet writer of science fiction stories in the 1920s. And this is the story he told in this newspaper. Amid the peaceful demonstrations made up of, quote, a battalion of workers, soldiers, female workers, Kyrgyz in bright vests, and orchestras, A.N. Tolstoy reported seeing banners with "Long live the Russian people, long live the brotherhood of all people," and above it all, the touching portrait of Tolstoy. Here we have this great use of Tolstoy that you'll see in these early documents, that Tolstoy is the unifier of class. All the different classes, the peasants, the workers, the intellectuals, the nationalists, they all agree that Tolstoy represents Russianness. And so Tolstoy's image becomes this way to understand the Russian Revolution, the first revolution, the February Revolution, the bourgeois revolution, as a healing of the class conflicts in Russia. Such mass expressions of revolutionary zeal involving Tolstoy were widely reported in the press of the time. I found proclamations never to forget Tolstoy at numerous rallies in Moscow, Petersburg, and the provinces, the bearing of his portraits during every possible demonstration, and the placing of busts of Tolstoy where the Tsarist memorial had been dismantled. Right? I found this great. I mean, if you know the history of the French Revolution, of course, this is exactly what happened. Only instead of Tolstoy's bust replacing the bust of the monarch, it was Rousseau's bust. And so Tolstoy basically becomes, for the Russian Revolution, what Rousseau was for the French Revolution. Although I think it's much more complicated than that, because there really wasn't a political cult of Rousseau that existed before the revolution in France. The political cult of Rousseau was a result of the revolution in France. They needed a hero, and they constructed a hero. Tolstoy's case is very different because Tolstoy existed already as a political myth, already as a political icon before the revolution. So this is this essential difference. But still, right, revolutions need their icons. Revolutions need their idols. And it's Tolstoy who is the idol. The foreign press likewise tended to identify initially the revolutionary period with Tolstoy's image. In its reporting on the February Revolution in Russia, on the same page one found a detailed description of Tsar Nicholas's arrest, and this was the headline, "Ex-Tsar guarded, has fits of crying, son well, Empress better." The New York Times printed the following tableau of class harmony under the title, "Great crowd of soldiers and workers greet his widow at her home. A great crowd of peasants, soldiers, and workmen." Again, this idea of Tolstoy uniting all the different classes. Says a Reuters dispatch from Petrograd, "When singing and cheering to the house of the late Count Tolstoy, Yasnaya Polyana, and sent a deputation to greet the widowed countess in behalf of the Russian people. The countess was asked to come out with the portrait of Count Tolstoy, and she complied. Thereupon, all knelt and chanted." In her introduction to Tolstoy's much-anticipated diary published in the United States during the inter-revolutionary period, Tolstoy's diaries were a phenomenon. Most people didn't know that Tolstoy was a diarist, even when he was alive. People knew that he kept diaries, but they didn't realize that they were as voluminous as they were. And so his diaries were published in 1915 and 1916 in Russia, and they created a public, everybody wanted to read Tolstoy's diaries, especially because his early diaries are really quite salacious. If you've ever read his early diaries, it's basically a documentation of all the wenches that he knew, and all the drinking that he'd done, and all the gambling, and all the losses, and all the awful things that he'd done in the wars. And people found those stories against the backdrop of their idea of who Tolstoy was to be really, really engaging. And so the diaries are translated almost immediately and published in 1917. And so this published actually in the spring of 1917, right after the Russian Revolution. And I found this foreword by this woman named Rose Strunsky, who was a really well-known Bolshevik sympathizer. She was a communist, and she'd lived in Russia, and she was a communist in New York. And she wrote the introduction to Tolstoy's diary. And this is what she has to say. This is what it reads in the diary. "The ultimate meaning of the Russian Revolution, which took place in March 1917, can be best understood through the pages of the Journal of Leo Tolstoy, which is printed here. The spiritual qualities which make up the mind and personality of Tolstoy are the spiritual qualities which make up the new era. No land but Russia could have produced a Tolstoy, and in no land but Russia could Tolstoy have been so embraced and so absorbed. The first act of the March Revolution was to redecorate the grave of Tolstoy in the forest of Zakaz, right outside Yasnaya Polyana, to make the sacred pilgrimage to his resting place and tell the father of the good news. The will of God is being established. Reason is awakened in man. The insistent call to the peoples of the world to overthrow all oppressors and live together in mutual harmony. The trumpet calls of a democracy whose tones are so strange and new that we across the border seem not to hear or understand them. All have their spiritual counterpart in the pages of this book. It is Russia that speaks here." Tolstoy, and that's the end. Tolstoy is the father of the revolution, and if the outside world wishes to understand what is going on in Russia, it needs Tolstoy's own story. Russia speaks the language of revolution through Tolstoy's diaries. For those who had little sympathy for the revolution, Tolstoy was likewise the clue to the riddle of what was happening. Since Tolstoy was virtually synonymous with opposition to war and refusal to comply with military orders, he was often blamed in the Russian press for soldiers' desertion on the fronts of the Great War. In fact, Tolstoy's followers, Tolstoy, you gathered from one of these images, he identified the commandment, the negative commandment on the Sermon on the Mount against resisting evil by force, turn the other cheek, as the essence of Christ's message. And so not participating in war, rejecting war, refusing to serve in the Russian army. That became, to be a conscientious objector meant to be a Tolstoyan, and vice versa. During the war, Tolstoy's disciples, people like Chertkov and Biryukov, who worked with him while he was alive, they printed tens of thousands of copies of Tolstoy's anti-war writings and distributed them on the front line at danger to their own life. They didn't do it themselves, but they sent these out and seeded them among the troops. And back at home in Moscow and in Petrograd, Tolstoy's works like a soldier's, what's it? How did I translate this? A soldier's memo. This is a great work by Tolstoy. It's quite funny. The Pamyatka is this list of rules that soldiers are supposed to follow, and it's in every barracks of every Russian military camp, and all the soldiers are supposed to know it by heart. Tolstoy rewrote them, and in which he inveighed against participating in military service and against killing and using violence and all this, and these were distributed everywhere in Russia during this time. And if you know the story of the Russian participation in the First World War, basically as soon as the revolution happened, well, even long before the revolution happened, Russia had a terrible problem with desertion on the front line. The Russian troops would just walk off from the front line, and many people rightly attributed this to Tolstoy's influence. I mean, of course, the fact that it was trench warfare and that the Russians didn't have any food or weapons probably contributed to it, but many people identified desertion in the Russian army with Tolstoy. The New York Times editorial board in July of 1917 went so far as to attribute the collapse of the Russian front to the, quote, senile vaporings of Tolstoy. In June of 1917, amid widespread reports of Russian desertion, the Swiss newspaper Gazette de Lausanne reported that the Germans were newly optimistic about their chances in the war and laid the blame principally on the influence of Tolstoy's theories. So you see again, once again, that if you want to understand the Russian war, if you want to understand what's happening in Russia, all you have to do is look at what Tolstoy wrote, and it's kind of the cause of what's going on, and it's the key that explains the riddle. Let me offer one final example of the early appropriation of Tolstoy's image as a marker of continuity, pre- and post-revolution. Tolstoy's name, in addition to being closely aligned with the idea of pacifism and desertion, was also closely associated with land reform and what was called the land question. Russia was 80% peasant. Most of the peasants didn't own the land that they worked on, and Tolstoy felt like this was a great problem. Many people, widely perceived that the main problem in Russia was a problem of land ownership, and Tolstoy was really the leading spokesman for land reform. His position was derived mostly from the American writer, political scientist, and economist Henry George, who recommended that the state abolish private property and nationalize all agricultural land. Dozens of pamphlets containing his articles, Tolstoy's articles and letters on the land question were printed in 1917. I count at least 3 editions of The Great Sin, which is his main work on land reform. He considered land ownership to be a sin. And various other writings on the land appeared in 1917 alone. A certain M. Gausner, who I haven't been able to identify who exactly this fellow is, in a pamphlet entitled L.N. Tolstoy on Land, argued that the Constituent Assembly is famous for being the first truly democratically elected parliamentary body, constitutional parliamentary body in Russia. It meant for all of 3 hours before it sort of fell apart. But it fell apart but continued to exist during this entire period between the February Revolution and the October Revolution, and there were great plans for it. It was called the Constituent Assembly. Gausner, in this pamphlet, argued that the Constituent Assembly, I've been able to figure out that Gausner must have been a member of the Constituent Assembly, but I haven't been able to, I looked at all the roles and haven't been able to find who he is. Maybe this is a pseudonym, I don't know. It was a chaotic time. Invoked Tolstoy's authority for the Assembly's planned land reforms. Gausner's explanation for Tolstoy's importance in deciding the just allocation of property was somewhat paradoxical. This is in this pamphlet. Only a nobleman and owner of vast tracts of land who witnessed firsthand the consequences of the unjust system could understand the importance of land to the Russian people. Tolstoy was the chief spokesman on the question of how land was to be divided in Russia, and he foresaw that private ownership of land would eventually disappear. Gausner begins the narrative of this pamphlet in the wake of the 1905 revolution, when in Tolstoy's article, The Great Sin, Tolstoy identified as the only thing of importance and interest for the entire people was the land question. Now Gausner says the old system has been destroyed and the Constituent Assembly would finally realize Tolstoy's vision. And this is what Gausner writes. Already at this point, concerning the decision of the Constituent Assembly, there can be no debate. Private ownership of land will disappear. he's right, but it's not the Constituent Assembly who makes it disappear, obviously. However, Gausner warns that it will be, quote, far from easy to divide the land, so before the decision of the Constituent Assembly, before the decision of the entire people, it will be useful to recall the opinion of the great writer of the Russian land, Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy. Much of the rest of the pamphlet is devoted to recounting Tolstoy's views on the land question, beginning with his comparison of private ownership of land to cannibalism. Tolstoy really liked those kinds of comparisons, but mostly devoted to Tolstoy's interest in the theories of the economist Henry George, who recommended a system in which land was essentially nationalized and rented out to the peasants. Gausner poses the question of why Tolstoy, given his otherwise quite radical views, would have defended such a relatively measured, incomplete, and bourgeois idea. The answer, proposes Gausner, lies in Tolstoy's own complicity. He was, of course, a major landowner, and for him, George's system, quote, offered the least effect on landowners while simultaneously promising a successful solution to the problem, end quote. Tolstoy understood that it was, quote, impossible to begrudge the people of the land because they were its rightful owners, but he was too dreamy, he uses the word tumanny, too cloudy, too kind of a man, and his heart could not come to terms with violent expropriation of land. Therefore, Gausner claims it, quote, it is our duty to hearken to the voice of L.N. Tolstoy and not to become violators arbitrarily taking land, for that is not our personal affair, but the affair of all the people, and the entire commune should do it through the Constituent Assembly. That's the end of the quote. The February Revolution and the Constituent Assembly were completing the Tolstoyan project of demolishing private ownership of land. The pamphlet ends with Gausner's claim that, quote, people have recognized their great sin and will no longer commit it. Tolstoy's enormous achievement consists of his having helped people to acknowledge this sin, the sin of land ownership, end quote. Gausner, this is kind of funny, I'll just mention, clearly this pamphlet was printed in a lot of haste, and there's this great typo that occurs at the last sentence of the pamphlet. And he wants to say that Tolstoy has helped people to acknowledge this sin, the sin of land ownership. This word acknowledge is soznats in Russian. Accidentally, the typographer writes down sozdats instead of soznats. The word sozdats is just different by one letter, N and D, but means to create. So instead, the pamphlet reads, Tolstoy's enormous achievement consists of him having helped people to create this sin, the sin of land ownership. I just thought that was funny. What a great typo. Anyway, for Gausner, Tolstoy was the key to the riddle of what was to become, a cipher of the revolution whose noble transgression, a landowner who preached the necessary destruction of his own class, offered a model for the potential for a peaceable progress. As a unifying image before whom the people owed a debt, Tolstoy was a sign of continuity and connection. His prophecy got it mostly right, but was flawed as it was wedded to outmoded and dated ideas that the revolution would update. That's it. I have dozens of pages. It goes on and on and on, and I could talk and talk and talk about some really interesting examples of Bolshevik appropriations of Tolstoy's image, and this shift that occurs once the Bolsheviks finally really consolidate power, and it's no longer, is Tolstoy in the situation where he can pass judgment on us? Now it's our turn to pass judgment on Tolstoy, and that happens in around 1924, 1925, just as the Bolsheviks finally defeat the whites out in Siberia, and they've consolidated their power, they're expanding their influence into social institutions. And it's fascinating, the first myth that they choose to dissemble is the myth of Tolstoy, because again, what's so fascinating about Tolstoy is that this revolution happens against the background of Tolstoy. The revolution has to sort of fight for an identity in a milieu that is dominated by this image of Tolstoy and these things. And what's so interesting is if you were to line up the Bolshevik program and the precepts of Tolstoyism, they're almost synonymous, right? I mean, the Bolsheviks really swept into power and enjoyed such a popular support, even though they supposedly are representatives of the proletariat, of the working industrial man. And in Russia, this is like 4% of the population, right? 80% of it is peasantry, and only a tiny, tiny percentage of it are industrial laborers. But the Bolsheviks are able to sort of consolidate popular support primarily because they are the party of peace. They are the only party that says, if we get into power, we will immediately end this imperialist war that we are fighting, and of course that's a Tolstoy position. The next thing they say is, we will reform land. We will equitably distribute land, and we'll use it for the public good. I mean, the land question was the Tolstoy question. They also swept into power to a certain extent on their anti-clerical platform. They were the anti-church party, right? They were the atheists, and Tolstoy himself. I mean, the opponent of the Russian church. Tolstoy was excommunicated from the Russian church in 1901. He was a constant and consistent and notable opponent of the Russian Orthodox Church, the official Russian Orthodox Church. The Bolsheviks, their aesthetic program, they were the it's weird to talk about this now, but they were a bunch of intellectuals who took the aesthetic program to be one of the most important things that the state could support. I mean, they were essentially a bunch of artist intellectuals who took over a state. And they had a very clear artistic program, one that was critical of bourgeois art that does nothing but amuse the few and perpetuate the myths that support capitalism. That aesthetic program was Tolstoy's aesthetic program. I mean, every time the Bolsheviks turned and talked about what makes them Bolsheviks, what they found was that they were enunciating Tolstoyan dicta over and over again. Now, there are also very, very clear differences between the Bolsheviks and Tolstoy, but the popular, those aspects of Bolshevism that attracted popular support were Tolstoyan. And Tolstoy enjoyed just so much authority that, and this just so irritated the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky, so much, because the Bolsheviks really prided themselves on being new, right? That's what the Bolsheviks were all about. We are scientific, we are materialists, we are the future. We know the science of the evolution of society. We have no ties to the old world. We are a clean break with bourgeois, imperial, Western civilization. In fact, they were very much so Orientalist in their orientation. And again and again and again, they found themselves basically occupying the place that Tolstoy occupied. And here they are priding themselves on being a break with the past, on being new, on being scientific, on being industrial, and they're tied to Tolstoy. And you saw these images of Tolstoy, who in so many ways seems to instantiate the old world and embrace the values of pre-civilization. And yet the Bolsheviks are enunciating the various philosophical, religious, and aesthetic positions of Tolstoy, right? So this is what the Bolsheviks had to deal with, and this is why his image was so contentious. And what you'll find is that the whites argue that Tolstoy would have been with them, and the reds argue that Tolstoy would have been with them, and everybody has to rewrite Tolstoy because, of course, as I tried to demonstrate, Tolstoy wouldn't have been with any of them, right? We already know this, right? I mean, he already played he was in the dress rehearsal. He was in the 1905 revolution. This is the further iterations of this project that kind of trace this very, very short period in Russian history, 1917 to 1924, and the pivotal role that Tolstoy plays in the debates of surrounding the Russian Revolution. So I gave you just some of the primary documents. And like I said, this story has been basically ignored or suppressed for lots of reasons, and I could go on and on about why we don't know this part of Tolstoy, why we only recognize, why we all sort of worship at the throne of Tolstoy, the literary artist, rather than worshiping at the throne of Tolstoy, the political figure. But that's the case. Tolstoy is very constructed, right? And I don't think that I've peeled back layers and revealed the real Tolstoy, because you peel back the layers of Tolstoy and all you find are more layers, right? And Tolstoy, who, if you know anything about Tolstoy, was so concerned with the category of authenticity, right? Over and over again, he wants to find the authentic life, the authentic message of Jesus, what it means to be authentically Russian, what is authentic art, and all these things. And yet, he himself was this very, very deliberate construction. There is no authentic Tolstoy. In every attempt to peel back the layers, it's like an onion, and you get to the end and there's nothing there. And Tolstoy is very, very, very much so. He participated in this construction, in this onion that is Tolstoy. So I'm more than happy to entertain any questions or reactions. When I've given this presentation to Tolstoy scholars, it's been sort of mixed. Half the people think this is really interesting, and half of them think that it's defamation of character. You all aren't Tolstoy scholars by and large, I assume. So maybe you don't have a position to protect. But I'm happy to answer questions or anything.
I can understand that, say, you're a middle-class American woman sitting at home in, 1905 in the newspaper. You might have some sense, this is what I'm asking, of Tolstoy as a celebrity. Did you have any sense of him as a cult figure, being his political, that really traveled outside Russia? That was
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The kind of land reform issues or something that Tolstoy's
Yeah, there's an excellent book on American perceptions of the 1905 revolution, absolutely. I mean, Tolstoy was a tourist destination, and you can open up the New York Times. You can find so many of these, I went to visit Tolstoy articles, and I listened to what the master had to say, and he was published, widely. I mean, think about this. I don't know how well you know Tolstoy's works, but there's this work that he wrote called the Kreutzer Sonata, which is this incredibly racy for the time book about this guy who, out of jealousy, murders his wife, and it was immediately banned in Russia. It couldn't possibly be published in Russia. But Tolstoy in 1885 gave up copyright privileges on everything printed before 1881. And that meant that you could publish anything by Tolstoy. You didn't have to have any permission. You didn't have to pay him any royalty. You didn't have to ask us, if I can translate this or anything like that. The year after Tolstoy finished the Kreutzer Sonata, you can go to I've forgotten the name. There's a record of publication in the United States. It's an index. All librarians know it. And you can go to that year. And there were 19 separate editions of the Kreutzer Sonata printed the next year in America. It was banned for transport in the U.S. press, in the U.S. Post, sorry. You couldn't legally transport it in the U.S. Post, which of course just did nothing. There's this great anecdote. This woman writes Tolstoy. This is I'm so bad with dates. This is like 1889, 1890. This is really the very, no, it's a little bit later. It's mid-1890s when this happens in the United States. And there's this woman who writes him from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She writes in this letter. It's in his complete collected works. And she says, I am sitting in my office here in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and there is a man down on the street with a basket full of your new story, Kreutzer Sonata. And there's a long line of people waiting to purchase it. And as soon as he reaches in to the basket to pick up the book, he has to grab another one and give it to the next person. Now, I read this, and yeah, that's really cool that, Tolstoy created such a sensation. But really what strikes me is Cedar Rapids, right? I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, Tolstoy is a phenomenon. Everybody knows what Tolstoy thinks about sex and marriage. Everybody knows what Tolstoy thinks about the Tsar. Everybody knows what Tolstoy thinks about revolution. Yeah, I mean, he was one of the most famous people living. And everybody knew what he stood for. Everybody understood that he was, in him was cathected all of the resistance to what was bad in Russia and in the United States. Lots of people thought there were a lot of things bad in Russia, right? And we, sort of spent the end of the 19th century writing and talking about how bad things were in Russia. And Tolstoy was the image of the anti-establishment. So, yeah, people. I mean, he was, yes. Housewives knew who Tolstoy was, and they knew what he stood for. This was, he was Madonna. He was a celebrity. He wasn't just like Madonna, obviously, but.
People don't know what Madonna stands for. Does she stand for?
No, but I do say, I would say that it's in the exact same way that people know what Madonna, who should I say? Kids. Huh? Britney Spears, yeah, there we go. I need to be more up to date. And we all know what Britney Spears stands for, right? In a weird sort of way, she stands for a set of values, right? And we know what those values are. It's the same exact thing with Tolstoy. I mean, quite obviously different, but the same sort of welter of ideas that sort of surrounded Tolstoy.
This is like my first time actually learning about Tolstoy. I don't know anything about him, but at the end of your lecture, you said like some Tolstoy scholars think it's defamation.
Yeah.
I'd like to know why they think that is.
Well, because, I mean, there was, especially in the Soviet Union, it's less so the case now, but especially in the Soviet Union, but also in America, Tolstoy is sort of a sacred figure, right? I mean, he's the great writer, and to talk about him as a public figure, I mean, I gave a presentation on Tolstoy's feet at Yasnaya Polyana, his ancestral estate, last August. And I talked about the public fascination with Tolstoy's feet and what it meant. And you just looked at those pictures, right? And every image of Tolstoy, his feet are bare. And I asked the question, what is this obsession with Tolstoy's feet? And the reaction was, to their credit, they were fairly accepting of it. But there were clearly people who felt like this was irreverent. If you ever go, you should go to Yasnaya Polyana. You should go to Russia. You should go to Tula and take the train or a taxi to Yasnaya Polyana. It's a shrine. You walk on the sacred ground of Tolstoy. And it's an institution, and it's an institution that is defined by values that are not to be questioned. And those values are that Tolstoy was the great writer of the Russian land, and he was the author of Anna Karenina and Tolstoy. And then there's an asterisk, and then it says, and a lot of other works that we're not going to talk about. And those other works that people don't talk about. I mean, he wrote, the Tolstoy that we sort of read now died in 1874 or 1875 and was reborn as this other Tolstoy after his religious conversion that happened, it's hard to date, but sometime in the 1870s. And these two Tolstoys, it's, then at the time when he was alive, they coexisted, right? You could have both Tolstoy the writer and Tolstoy the heretic, Tolstoy the politician, Tolstoy the religious fanatic, Tolstoy the prophet, Tolstoy the cult leader. Those two existed together, but I can actually date it. Around 1928, the Soviet Union decided that Tolstoy was going to be just Tolstoy the artist. And they very deliberately, very carefully constructed the image of this great Russian writer, this sage, the author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, the representative of what it was to be Russian in the world. And that couldn't include, this guy beating on the drum, right? This couldn't include the guy up in the hot air balloon shouting about just don't, resist evil. This couldn't include the guy who didn't wear shoes. They needed a cleaned up version of Tolstoy, and they spent a lot of money and they used a lot of capital to create this institution of Tolstoy. I started off this, right? I mean, I love this image. Paul asked me, "Is that photoshopped?" Because it looks photoshopped, but it's not. This is the throne of Tolstoy, right? And on either side, just like the icons on either side of the iconostas, there's Stalin and Lenin, and then you could imagine that about this is taken in 1928. You can imagine about 30 years exactly later, Stalin's portrait just gets ripped down, right? And it's just Lenin looking on reverently at Tolstoy, and then about 30 years later, somebody comes along and grabs Lenin's, pulls him down, and who stays standing? I've been to this school where this picture was taken, and Tolstoy is still there, but Lenin and Stalin are no longer, right? Yeah. So, that's why. I mean, he was a religious figure. I mean, he was transformed from a religious figure into a very different kind of figure around whom there was a halo of veneration. And you don't mess with that, right? You don't stick pins in those sorts of images, not without people getting a little bent out of shape. Yeah. You don't talk about Tolstoy's feet, just like you, wouldn't talk about God's feet. Are there any other questions?
I started learning about Tolstoy this year. I know he was an influence.
And let me guess, you didn't learn this part of Tolstoy.
Not exactly.
Yeah.
What I did in research for a presentation, a lot of it was about Gandhi
Uh-huh.
and his correspondence with him.
Gandhi wrote Tolstoy a letter in 1908 or 1909. Is that right? Yeah. Tolstoy and Gandhi corresponded. Gandhi wrote Tolstoy a letter because Gandhi had just read "The Kingdom of God is Within You," which he read while he was a barrister, a lawyer in South Africa, and he ripped off his lawyer's clothes and pulled on his loincloth and got on a train and a steamer and went back to Gujaristan and opened up an ashram called Tolstoy Camp, and it began the Indian Revolution on Tolstoyan principles. Tolstoy's religion works very well in the East because it is in so many ways a rejection of Western ideas of what it means to lead a righteous life. And Gandhi was able, virtually without changing a thing about Tolstoy, to convert Tolstoyism into, what's the word? The true path, the Hindu, pseudo-Hindu philosophy that Gandhi preached, and that led to the nonviolent revolution in India in 1930s.
I want to ask about did you find any kind of rub between that revolution and the one in 1917 as far as Tolstoy?
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, there's a good book. It's in French, but did you look at there's a book called Tolstoy et Gandhi. It's a pretty good book that traces that, but that is forgotten. I mean, the Tolstoy aspect of Gandhi is just, you pick up a popular book on Gandhi and you won't find a mention of Tolstoy. But in fact, the Gandhian revolution was essentially a Tolstoyan revolution. It was based exclusively and explicitly on Tolstoyan precepts, which were very easy to drag over into sort of a rejection of modernity and an embrace of Indian identity. And by the way, it was easy to do because Tolstoy developed his religious view while reading about Buddhism and Taoism and other Eastern mysticisms. And so it was pretty easy for the Indians to understand Tolstoy. You know, Tolstoy's Christ might as well have been Buddha. There are differences, but yeah. So I would say that Tolstoy Easternized Christianity, and that was very easy for the Indians to absorb. But again, this is another sort of thing that you would never, ever, ever know, because Tolstoy is not a political actor. He's an artist. So what are you doing talking about art, about an artist, when we're talking about history and Gandhi and politics and revolution? So, any other questions?
Thanks very much.
Thank you for your attention.